Hi, Cathy.
Hi.
Can you tell us what securitization is?
Okay. So securitization is a process by which a bunch of different loans are bundled together. They're pooled together. So like, you know, you have a credit card bill and I have a credit card bill and Joe over there has a credit card bill. Or it could be mortgages that we have to pay once a month. Or it could be student loans. And so just securitization usually just refers to any kind of debt. And the point is that the people who get owed this money, they don't like how inconsistently they get paid. So with mortgages, they might get paid once a month until all of a sudden you sell your house. And then everything gets paid back all at once. And it's very uneven and choppy for them. And they're big investors, like their banks or pension funds. And they want things to be very predictable and smooth and consistent. So what they do is instead of just owning yours, they own a whole bunch of things. And instead of actually owning a bunch of things, the bank does the middleman job of buying up a bunch of these debts and combining them into a big pool, and that's called securitization, and then selling pieces of that pool to these big investors that are pretty much, they're trying to guarantee smoothness like I just described.
And do we still know who these like mortgages belong to when you put them in a pool?
Well, technically you should, right? I mean, I always thought if you know how to like move the money around after someone pays, then you should actually be able to also figure out who owns things. It's kind of frustrating and shocking how little people really did understand, legally speaking, who owned what. And that was part of the problem, of course, leading up to the financial crisis, is that the actual record keeping became worse and worse by construction, because it was in the interest of the people selling these loans, these pooled loans, the securitized instruments. It was in their best interest not to show too much information of what this actual underlying loans were made from. So they actually made it harder and harder to dig in, because they figured the obstacle for digging in for a given investor would be too large for anyone to bother doing it, which was pretty much true.
So, but they started with securitization, which was like one layer,
yeah,
right? But then they moved on to that, and then there became bigger and bigger layers and more complicated. Like, for example, the so-called CDOs. What are they?
Okay, so securitization in and of itself isn't such a bad idea. The idea that you're going to combine securitization with a sort of forgetfulness of what the actual underlying loans are is where it starts getting to be a bad idea. And people kind of knew that it was a bad idea, and what they did was they said, oh, well, I'm being risky with my purchase of this loan, this high risk loan, so I'm going to protect myself. And so they invented this whole new instrument class called credit default swaps, which was a way of protecting themselves against losses on these loans. And it was one of the ways they sort of got out of feeling guilty for not understanding what the underlying loans were. So they were like, well, we don't really know what the underlying loans are, and we could spend a lot of time and effort, i.e. money, understanding those loans at the very basic level, but instead we're just going to pay for insurance on top of it. So if the loan goes bad, we get paid from these people who are insuring us, which is usually AIG.
And then they started playing with these CDSs, right? And there you got something called like synthetic CDO?
Right, so CDOs, going back to CDOs, which I didn't really answer before, CDOs are just, they're just credit debt obligations, I think. They literally are what I just said, securitized debt obligations. So they're just exactly what I just said. CDOs are, generally speaking, any kind of debt, credit card, medical, student debt, mortgages. Mortgage-backed securities are a specific kind that are only mortgages in the pool. CDOs are more generic, car loans, things like that. Then what you had was, once you had this new industry called credit default swaps, there was no regulation on it, partly because the people on the inside refused to let there be a regulation on it. This idea that the markets could regulate themselves and nobody would take more risk on than they should have, which was completely bogus. But once you had this credit default swap market, you had quants, mathematicians like what I used to do, who said, well, what can we do with these? And it was just its own thing, right? And so one thing they realized they could do was they could buy a bunch of them. You didn't actually have to use them like insurance. You could use them as bets. And the bets were that these things, well, depending on which side of the credit default swap you were in. If you were on AIG side and you were guaranteeing a bunch of loans, then their bet was the amount of money we're going to get paid for insuring stuff is way more than they will ever have to pay out in bad loans when the bad loans go bad. The other side of it, of course, the credit default swap market, were the people who were betting that these loans really would go bad. And so what you see, and by the way, they were allowed to buy as many as they wanted on anything. And so what they did was they sort of actually invented, like essentially what the story of Magnetar is. They invented securitized debts that were built to go bad, and then they could make a lot of money on credit default swaps because people were selling credit default swaps too cheaply. So what they realized is that at some point nobody knew what was going on in the underlying loans. So why don't they make a particularly toxic product with particularly like awful loans, and then sell those loans and then buy credit default swaps on those loans because they knew that they were going to explode, because they were built to explode.
And what does that still have to do with banking, the initial idea of banking and the initial idea of capitalism?
Well,
that's
let
two
me tell you,
different stories.
First, let's do banking. Banks are in charge of taking on long-term risk so that you don't have to. So that's a good thing about banks, right? What they do is they take on your mortgage debt, which is a 30-year thing. Okay, it's a lot of risk and it's an agreement, a contract that lasts 30 years. And in exchange, they allow you to have your cash money anytime you want. So they don't know when you're going to want your cash, but the rule is you get to go get your cash whenever you want it. But they don't get to get their money back for 30 years. So their job as a middleman is we take long-term risks in exchange for some fees, and we give you short-term liquidity. And securitization actually goes in that direction, of course, because securitization is a way for banks to take on this long-term risk in a more efficient way, as long as they have enough of these mortgages or whatever kind of loans to pool so that their overall risk is more predictable. It is a way for them to do their job more efficiently. The problem was when they started to do way more than their job. They started to say, hey, we can make bets on this. Hey, we can lie about the underlying models, the underlying loans, and hey, we can like keep incredibly shitty records and have no one check because everyone's so focused on like greed and short-term profits. In fact, it was all about the insiders, like everybody involved in this whole thing except some, of course, the dumb money investors who were convinced to buy some of these explosive loan-backed securitized loans. Most of these people were in on the game.
So you keep mentioning the word risk, and the financial system is based on risk, and they design risk models. Can you explain this?
So yeah, I mean, risk is a very generic term, and it should be understood as like anybody would understand risk. So like, there's lots of ways of thinking about risk. What people do in finance that often makes them money is sort of try to narrowly define risk so that they can pretend they're working or they're hedging their risk. So if you define risk very generally, it's very hard to prove that you're dealing with risk generally. But if you define general risk as incredibly narrow financial market risk or something, then you're allowing yourself to double or triple or to sort of squeeze out profits because of the risk you're not thinking about. So one of the risks that people weren't thinking about in this whole mortgage-backed security, credit default swap, CDO stuff were like counterparty risk. That was a risk that was growing and growing and growing, and once Lehman fell, we saw how enormous that risk was. And what I mean by that is the banks got more and more interconnected with thousands upon thousands of tens of thousands of contracts that were connecting all the different banks and investment banks. And when Lehman fell, like all those were frozen. And a given bank may have actually netted out their exposure. They're like, they might owe Lehman $1 million on this transaction, but be owed by Lehman $1 million in that transaction. But it was still completely a pain in their ass to figure out what next, because that essentially they had become addicted to this like very fast cycle of movement between banks and investment banks. And when Lehman fell, all that pipe in the huge network of pipes of the financial system was just blocked. And it exposed this incredible interconnectedness and counterparty risk that everyone in sight was taking on. That's one of the risks that people don't really think about. But yeah, I mean, risk could be anything. Another risk that people weren't taking seriously was the risk that the housing market was a bubble and could pop. Everything was based on historical prices, which is just a general blind spot with financial analysts, that they always use historical data, even now, to try to predict the future. And historically speaking, housing prices hadn't gone down, so they were just all under that assumption. Or you could say that they weren't actually working under that assumption, but individually they were thinking the fastest way for me to get enough money for a summer house is if I hope this bubble lasts until my next bonus.
But I read that they were counting on the bubble to burst in like 2 to 4 years or something.
I think on the inside, most people knew it was a bubble and it was going to burst. But I don't think they were actually counting on it. Most people were not actually betting. See, in finance, it's always about putting your money where your mouth is. If you actually have a belief, you're supposed to bet on it. And like just by looking at how many people lost money, or didn't make money anyway, when that happened, I don't think it's fair to say that everybody was counting on it to burst in a specific time.
Okay. So were they predicting the bailout? Were they counting on getting bailed out?
No. I mean, look, you could think of it as yes, or you could think of it as no. I actually think the answer is no. I think the answer is nobody gave a shit. Nobody actually gave a shit. They were just like, well, this system is totally corrupt. I mean, the insiders knew that. The insiders knew that it was a complete shit show with all the incredibly bad CDOs and mortgage-backed securities. And they were like, they had no idea what was going to happen, but they knew that they already made a lot of money. And they really didn't feel responsible. Each of them felt like they had done just some small part and they weren't really to blame. Everybody had someone else to point to. And most people pointed up, but then the ironic thing was that the people at the very top of the Fed and the Treasury were macroeconomists who didn't actually know enough about the market to understand how bad it was.
Can you describe the situation at the time of the bailout?
The situation was a panic at the time of the bailout. After Lehman fell, nobody knew who was going to be next to fall. And everybody knew that the markets had suddenly been exposed as dysfunctional. The overnight credit markets, which were used just for a bank to close its doors on Tuesday and open up on Wednesday, were frozen, which meant literally that any bank at any time, even if it had a pretty good portfolio, might just not be able to function. In particular, meant that payroll might not have been able to be met for the average person in this country, that people might not have been able to get money out of the bank if they went to the bank. So the risks were very real at the time of the bailout. Something needed to be done. And I don't judge badly the government for stepping in and doing something. But I do judge the government for what it did and how it did it. There were lots of other options for them. And I could go on a lot at length about like what the other things they could have done. That's what I wrote about in my chapter on the bailout.
Could you mention a couple?
Sure. A couple are that they could have let the banks fail and just made sure that payroll was met and that cash was available. And they just sort of said, you guys fucked up. You guys messed up. And like the private banks and investment banks are not functioning. So we need to make sure that the average person doesn't have no currency. That there has to be the real economy has to continue while you guys sort yourselves out, but we're not bailing you out. That's one thing. Another thing is the banks could have been bailed out but nationalized, just owned literally by the government, all the CEOs, everybody all the managers could have been fired. And that didn't happen. Even so, like, the thing that really outrages me more than the actual actions of the at the moment of the bailout, because I know politicians aren't finance insiders, and the finance insiders, even the macroeconomists of the Fed and Treasury, were telling them this is an emergency, you need an expert to know how to do this, and we have to keep the experts in their jobs because they're the only ones that can sort this out. So I can understand why politicians didn't doubt that at the moment of panic. What really gets to me is what's happened since then, and how it's a continual bailout. How we have too big to fail subsidies. We have made the banking system more concentrated in fewer banks. We haven't gotten Dodd-Frank started. It's way behind schedule, and it's been watered down extremely by lobbyists, and nobody's doing anything about it. In some sense, the financial industry has done an incredible job of paying both sides of government to, Democrats, Republicans, to not think about it, not talk about it. Right. So one of the things that really bugged me is in the presidential debates, it just never got discussed. Never got discussed. At the Democratic and Republican conventions, it never got discussed. But by the way, the financial industry had big parties at both of those conventions, so they just basically bought out the government. That's really frustrating, because what we saw is the financial industry broke the world, scared the politicians into not acting, and now it's buying politicians to continue to not act. And in the meantime, the rest of us who are taxpayers and help bail out those banks haven't seen a dysfunctional system be replaced. So our real question is, what did we bail out, and why? Why should we continue to bail out this system?
Yeah, and this whole process leaves me to the question, what happened to democracy? Was the democratic process honored during the bailout? And also, for the proponents of capitalism, letting the banks fail, isn't that exactly what capitalism is supposed to be?
Yeah, good points. So first, you could say we have democracy because we voted Obama in a second time. We did that. Romney and Obama were almost identical on financial their platforms, which were non-existent. Their platforms are basically pretend to care, pretend to have a hard line with respect to fraud in the banks, and actually don't do anything except continuously bail out the banks in various ways by sort of getting them out of liability and giving them small wrist slaps, fines, and not making them admit culpability. And in fact, the fines are paid by the shareholders, not the people who got rich, and they don't lose their job and they don't go to jail. So they're really, really weak tools, and they talk about them as if they're strong, but they're really not. In terms of capitalism, yes, I don't think. That's what's funny about being an occupier, is that I actually have a lot in common with some of the Tea Partyists. I'll tell you the truth. What we can all agree on is this is not capitalism. This is crony capitalism, I guess. But the idea that something that has utterly failed is not allowed to actually fail that's nobody's ideal. Okay.
So you want to have a combination of capitalism and socialism?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying we can all agree that it's not capitalism. In terms of what would be ideal.
Yeah.
I actually am kind of neutral to various visions, all of which are not this one. So one of my visions is you guarantee a sort of service banking. You have a national bank that is considered like the post office. Not that the post office is doing awesome right now. It's not. But it functions, and it is really, really boring. It does what it does, and it doesn't do anything else. So they have a national bank would be appropriate, I think, or you'd have size limits on banks so that they can't threaten the entire system if they fail. Mm-hmm. So you get rid of too big to fail banks. So you either have to get rid of too big to fail banks and keep them because they're private, and no private institution should have that much power, or you say, okay, fine, we're going to have big banks, but then they're not private.
Right. But some said, but the banks paid back the money.
Yeah, so that's, a very narrow way of thinking, and I address that in my chapter. First of all, they didn't really pay back. They didn't get the loans on the terms that were reasonable. They got free money. If they hadn't had the United States government to give them that money, the terms of their loans would have been much, much, much harder if they had to borrow from China or the Middle East. Second of all, they actually paid back their debts before they could afford to because they wanted to look good, and the government had a vested interest also. Basically, they teamed up with Geithner and those guys to make themselves look strong by paying back their money before they could actually afford to pay back the money. So it was just kind of a political thing that they had paid back their money. Part of the reason they paid back their money is because there was a threat of a law that said if you were still being bailed out by the banks, you couldn't pay really big bonuses. So a lot of it was just like political theater so that it would seem strong, and oh, by the way, we're also paying huge bonuses. And finally, I think the focus on the money is also too narrow. I think for me, it's about risk. It's about systemic risk. It's about what's going to happen in the future, what kind of incentives are being encouraged. And what I see is that we have a precedent now that the government, when the banks mess everything up, the government will come in and fix that, their problems. So whenever someone says they paid back the money, I always say they might have paid back the money, but they didn't take back their risk. We have officially inherited that risk, and we have not returned it to the banks. And nobody thinks we have. And the idea that we have a viable path towards bankruptcy for one of these too big to fail banks is, again, political theater. There is no way we actually have a plan if one of these banks really gets screwed again.
And do you think they're still doing it, all the stuff that they're doing, or will they still risk getting into another crisis?
I absolutely think they're still doing it, and let's just keep this in mind. The individual working at this bank does not see it as a risk. They don't see themselves as responsible, just as the other ones who actually made the markets die. They didn't take response. How many people confessed? It just didn't happen. The system is set up to be so large and complicated and siloed that a given person in a given function just doesn't feel like they really are crucial to the functioning of the system. So they just don't feel culpable. And that's continuing now. And we have every reason to think it's worse than it used to be, because we have a couple of things that have made it worse. One of them is this too big to fail subsidy. I mean, Moody's came out and explained what the rating of the banks were with or without the government backing, and showed that the rating was quite bad, if I don't remember exactly, in the B range, if there weren't a government subsidy based on what they're doing, but it's a AAA because the government's backing it. So there's an explicit acknowledgement there of the fact that they're getting away with doing risky things because the government is backing them. Now, what does that mean for the person working inside one of those banks? It means that they get to do whatever they want because they know the government's backing them. So it's incentivizing them to do this again and faster. Because the other thing is that the fraud that has been discovered by the SEC, mostly, hasn't really been punished, as I said. The fines that have been levied are against the shareholders, not the people responsible, and they are fractions of the amount of profit they are making. Look at HSBC with the drug money laundering. Just fractions of the actual profit. So you should think of it more as a tax than as a punishment. And now once you have a price list for illegal activities, as the banks now have, once you have a price list, what's stopping you from doubling down on your fraud?
A lot of it hinges on those ratings, right? How much power do these credit rating agencies have, and what is their rating system based on? So
they don't have really that much power, nor do they have a lot of respect, because they themselves were bought during the crisis, and they AAA rated anything, including really terrible mortgage-backed securities. The fact that they still exist in exactly the same form that they did pre-crisis just points to how dysfunctional our regulation revamp has been under Dodd-Frank. We just haven't addressed anything. There was a hearing by the SEC. It was just token.
So we have a couple of entities, I believe, that are watching over all of this process and stuff. What are their results, and what can they do?
The entities I think you refer to as you know, the Fed and the SEC and the Treasury. Look, I mean, they could do a lot if they wanted to. They just don't want to. You know, Obama doesn't want to. And you know, we're writing right now. We're trying to write an op-ed about Gary Gensler and how he's been fired by Obama, really not reappointed to the CFTC chair. He's the only regulator that's been really doing his job, and he's being punished by not being reappointed because Obama doesn't want regulators to do their job.
Why not?
Look, Obama is afraid of finance, or for whatever reason. That's my belief. I don't know the guy personally, but my feeling is like the only thing that can explain his behavior is that he's afraid of all the bullies in finance, like Jamie Dimon, and all those guys who say, look, if you mess with us, we'll bring down the world, you know. And I mean, that's sort of my only explanation for why he loves Larry Summers so much, because the approach, if you're a fear-monger, like insider in finances, look, this stuff is so complicated, only real experts and mathematical geniuses could possibly understand this and regulate this and do something about this, and therefore you must trust the experts, and the expert of all is Larry Summers, so please trust him. And this is in spite of his absolutely horrendous record on common sense and diplomacy and politics. The guy. I mean, I'm glad he's not going to be Fed chair. Let's put it that way. But the real question is, like, you know, here's a guy, Gary Gensler, who's actually been doing his job in spite of the fact that he was at Goldman Sachs and was in the Treasury during deregulation. And you'd think, like, surprise, surprise, a man who's actually doing his job would be reappointed, but for some reason he's not. And the only conclusion I can take from that is Obama doesn't want someone who's effective.
So if we can't count on politicians to protect us from another crisis, what can we do as people,
Well, look, I mean, the thing that's good and bad about politicians is that they for whatever, I'm not saying this is just always true, but like they only do stuff when they have to, because they're going to lose votes if they don't have to. So it has to become an issue, a political issue, and that's where people come involved. They have to make it a political issue, and that's one of the reasons we're trying to educate people by writing the book Occupy Finance, is to get people sort of informed enough about the issues to make the demands that obviously need to be made.
Thank you.
Thanks.